Let me introduce these panelists. I'll read their short introductions, short bios. John McDonough, who is on my far right, has been writing and producing documentary features for All Things Considered with Robert Trout and Walter Cronkite. He worked with both of the journalist legends on features about their reports that covered Hitler's march in Austria and the countdown on World War II, the fall of France, the Battle of Britain, Pearl Harbor, the invasion of North Africa, the Battle of the Bulge, and many others. John also has been a frequent contributor to the American Scholar, American Heritage, and the Wall Street Journal for more than 20 years, and has been nominated 3 times for Grammy Awards for album note essays. He also is a devoted jazz scholar and has written many essays and critiques for Downbeat magazine. John McDonough. The gentleman sitting next to him is Joseph E. Persico. Joe received both a BA in English and Political Science from the New York State College for Teachers, now the University at Albany. He served with the U.S. Navy for 3 years as a lieutenant junior grade aboard a minesweeper, and also with NATO headquarters in Naples, Italy. He began a political writing career in 1956 as a writer and researcher for Governor W. Averell Harriman, eventually becoming the chief speechwriter for New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller. As a full-time author, his works include My Enemy, My Brother, Men and Days of Gettysburg, and the penetration of Nazi Germany by American secret agents during World War II. His topics also include American espionage, the Nuremberg war crimes trials, and broadcast journalist Edward R. Murrow. He also collaborated with former Secretary of State Colin L. Powell on his biography. Mr. Persico continues to publish books on historical subjects. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Joseph Persico.
I'm here by virtue of having been the author of a biography entitled Edward R. Murrow, an American Original. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Murrow during the war. For people of my generation, that is, too young to have participated in the war, yet old enough to have grown up during the war, the sound of that war, to a considerable extent, was the voice of Edward R. Murrow. I can remember very vividly as a high school kid getting dressed in the morning, and I could hear through the crackle and whine of shortwave radio that inimitable voice intoning, "This is London." That was not the way Murrow started out. Murrow had gone to Europe for CBS initially as a director of talks. What this meant was that he would seek out events that he would sign up to put on the air. For example, dog shows, bagpipe concerts, and he had a very small role in this. It's certainly not as the broadcaster we came to know. He would introduce girls' choir or whatever it was. In 1938, Adolf Hitler seizes Austria in what history records as the Anschluss. Murrow at the time was trying to sign up some acts in Warsaw. He immediately flew to Vienna, and he had instructions from his CBS boss, Bill Paley, to round up people who could go on the air and report the reaction to the Anschluss from European capitals, whether from London, Paris, Berlin, Rome. So what he did with his then assistant, William L. Shirer, was find print journalists, correspondents, who would go on the air and deliver these reports. At the same time, in doing so, Murrow went on the air for the first time himself as a serious broadcaster, and he was hooked. He and Shirer, right after this event, sat down and they started talking about the birth of a new breed of reporter, the broadcast journalist. no longer counting on print journalists, correspondents, but having people whose job was to purport the news over radio. His happy hunting ground was the United Press, the press's various bureaus in Europe. And from these UP offices, he recruited names that resonate now in broadcast journalism: Eric Sevareid, Charles Collingwood, Howard K. Smith, Richard Hotlett, who was supposed to be with us today, all of whom became known collectively as Murrow's Boys. He failed in 2 of his recruitment attempts. One person who we wanted very much to sign up was James Scotty Reston, at that point the New York Times correspondent. Murrow took him to lunch at Claridge's and wooed him, explained the glories of broadcast journalism. Scotty Reston said, "Ed, trying to get me to leave the New York Times is like asking me to leave my wife." So he did not succeed in enlisting Scotty Reston. Another target of his was another United Press reporter by the name of Walter Cronkite. So he brought Cronkite as well to Claridge's and made his pitch. Cronkite at this point with the UP was very happy, and he did not see broadcasting the news over the radio as a very serious medium. Besides, as he explained to Murrow, at this point, he was earning from UP $57.50 a week, and he was not about to leave that steady employment. Indeed, UP had offered him a $25 raise. So Murrow did not succeed in bringing to CBS Walter Cronkite. As we know, Walter comes in and he becomes a giant in television broadcasting, but he got there on his own steam, not as one of Murrow's boys. Murrow is in England in September of 1940, and on the 7th of that month, the Blitz begins, the series of German air raids over major British cities, which endured for something like over 70 nights. He was very frustrated by this experience. Murrow was broadcasting at this point from a small basement studio in the BBC's broadcasting house. Very frustrated because he knew that above him was going on during the Blitz this extraordinary drama. And he realized the unique potential of radio, that if he could broadcast live, he could go into American homes and tell what was happening during these raids instead of writing secondhand accounts from this basement, the BBC. So he went to the British Air Ministry and begged to be allowed to report while raids were in progress. He was turned down by the Air Ministry. The Air Ministry knew that the Germans monitored broadcasts, and the fear of the ministry officials was that if they would pick up a broadcaster like Murrow in the course of a raid, this would somehow give direction to the German bombers, and in effect Murrow would be acting as a spotter. So they stiffed him for a long time on this request. So Murrow, being tenacious and inventive, had an idea. He went to a former journalist to seek his support. He went to the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill clearly grasped the value to the Brits of having broadcasts about what the Blitz was really like, what was happening to the British people, have this radioed into American homes, talk to the Air Ministry, and Murrow then succeeded in achieving that almost iconic image that we have of him now, microphone in hand, standing on a London rooftop. They were really quite extraordinary broadcasts. You could hear the howl of the bombs as their fins cut the air coming down. You could hear the crump of the bombs as they exploded. You could hear even the cursing of the British aircraft batteries as they fired away. And you could hear the shrapnel from their aircraft rounds clanging into the street. And in these broadcasts, Murrow displayed what I think is one of his strongest qualities, and that is he had a way of seeing beneath the surface facts and bringing very fresh, very individualist insight to what he was seeing. Let me just give one example. In the course of a particularly bloody raid, he included this passage in his broadcast. What had happened was that there were 3 or 4 high school boys with some special training who had been flying around over London in about $100,000 worth of machinery. One of them had pressed a button. The fire and a number of casualties was the result. Something that amused me was that Murrow's choice as the bravest people during the Blitz were the hookers in London. He said they were out doing business no matter how severe the raid. Murrow had a rather chirpy sign-on that he used early in his career, which went something like this: "Hello, America, London calling." Well, he had a speech teacher who was very influential in his life by the name of Ida Lou Anderson. Ida wrote to Ed and said, "That will not do. What you should say in your broadcast is, 'This is London.'" And that's where that phrase came from. At this time, as the Blitz was pulverizing British cities, and Christmas started to approach in 1940, it seemed almost inappropriate for the British to wish each other a Merry Christmas. So they took instead to saying, "So long and good luck." Well, Murrow turned that around for his sign-off, "Good night and good luck," which, as we know, is the title of that very fine recent movie about the collision between Murrow and Joe McCarthy. Murrow was such a success that CBS brought him back to the States for a promotional speaking tour. They wanted to exploit the success he had achieved. He was honored at a number of dinners, and one of them, the then Librarian of Congress and poet, Archibald MacLeish, paid a tribute to him, which I'll quote from very briefly, because it seemed to capture the essence of what Murrow had become to American listeners. And MacLeish had this to say: "You laid the dead of London at our doors, and we knew the dead were our dead, were all men's dead. Without more emotion than needed be, you destroyed the superstition of distance and time." Murrow, while he was in the States, was invited to have dinner at the White House with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a fan of Murrow's, and he knew that he could probably get the best insight into how the British were taking it by having an opportunity to sit down with Murrow. The day that Murrow was supposed to go to dinner was a Sunday. He was out playing golf at the Burning Tree Club in Washington, and suddenly Caddy ran out and said the Japanese had just bombed Pearl Harbor. It's December 7th, 1941. Murrow's wife calls Eleanor Roosevelt and says, "I assume that the dinner is off." And Eleanor said, "No, we still have to eat. Please come." So Murrow and his wife went to the White House. They did not sit down immediately with FDR. They witnessed a parade of generals and admirals and military officials and leaders of Congress coming in and out constantly. But FDR sent word down he did not want Murrow to leave. Finally, at midnight, Murrow was called into the private study of the president. He's in there, he's haggard, he's drawn, and he's sipping a beer. And he explodes in front of Murrow and starts citing this dread inventory, what had happened at Pearl Harbor, the number of ships that have been sunk, the number of ships that have been damaged, the number of planes destroyed on the ground. Murrow is very perplexed by this performance. He goes back to his hotel and he says to his wife, "I don't know, was he just lashing out at someone who happened to be in his presence, who he trusted, or is he talking to a journalist?" He said, "I have in the palm of my hand probably the best story that I will ever have. I don't know what to do with it." In the end, he decided not to report what the president had said. He felt at this point given the shock to the American people, they should get the word about what had happened from Pearl Harbor from their president, from a government source. Murrow went back to England and continued his broadcast, and then sought to storm another barrier, just as he had done covering the raids live from the London rooftops. He wanted to go on combat missions. And again, he ran into a problem with the Air Ministry. They were very reluctant to do this. People like Murrow and probably Andy eventually persuaded the British to allow correspondents to go on these raids. And there was a lottery system set up, and finally Murrow's name was pulled from the hat, and he went on a raid, a very heavy-duty raid. There were 500 aircraft. He flew a British Lancaster bomber, and he was assigned to a plane called D for Dog. The skipper was a Scot by the name of Jock. The raid was rough. Murrow was aboard this aircraft as the flak was exploding around him from the German anti-aircraft batteries, and the searchlights were seeking to pick the planes out of the sky. Andy spoke of the rate of risk in these raids, something like 5%. This particular raid, there was a 10% casualty loss. That's 50 planes shot out of the sky. That's 500 crewmen either dead, captive, or injured. And on that particular raid, 2 aircraft which also had reporters did not return. Murrow came back to London and he wrote what is considered one of his classic broadcasts. It's entitled Orchestrated Hell. And now let me read just briefly a passage from Orchestrated Hell. With no warning at all, D-Dog was filled with an unhealthy white light. Steady, lads, Jock the pilot said, we've been coned. I was standing just behind Jock and could see the seams on the wings. The small incendiaries were going down like a fistful of white rice thrown on a piece of black velvet. The sticks of incendiaries made Berlin look like a badly laid out city. This report of his made quite a splash. Not only did people hear it over the air, but it was picked up by major dailies in London and reprinted. It was picked up in the United States by newspapers and it was reprinted. And Murrow, thereafter, decided to do this again. He was taking a great chance, which was driven home by the fact that this very aircraft that he had flown, D for Dog, its crew was lost a month after he had flown with them. Bill Paley, the head of CBS, was very concerned. He didn't want Murrow going on these combat missions. His view was this. For one thing, he had a very valuable property in Murrow by this point. And he said to Murrow, look, you wanted to get that story. What is the terror like of going on a combat mission? And Murrow said, no. What I experienced was the terror of going on a combat mission. But what these people do is they go again and again and again. And that is the story, that is the emotion, that is the experience that I want to capture. And before the war ended, Murrow had made 25 combat missions. Towards the end of the war, Ed was with the American forces driving into Germany, and he was with them when they liberated a camp called Buchenwald. Murrow is immediately surrounded by living skeletons, pallid piles of corpses. He did not have an interest in scoring scoops. What Murrow wanted to do was not be first, but hopefully to be best. So he went back to England and he tried to digest this horrific experience he had had at Buchenwald before doing anything. And he thereafter wrote his radio broadcast, entitled Buchenwald, and I will quote very briefly from that broadcast, which again became a classic of radio journalism. If you have no appetite to hear what Germans have done, now is a good time to switch off the radio. There surged around me an evil-smelling horde. Men and boys reached out to touch me. Death had already marked many of them. And he closed with this: if I've offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least bit sorry. I think that Murrow's importance in being a pioneer and developing this new form of reporting via radio is perhaps best illustrated in this point. When Murrow first got to London in 1937, he sought to be admitted to the American Association of Correspondents. He was turned down. The members of the organization didn't feel that a man who was lining up boys' choirs and dance bands belonged in their serious reporting organization. But by the time Murrow left, at the end of the war, he was the president of the American Association of Broadcasters in London. He comes home from the war, and as we know, he becomes a pioneer in television journalism, most notably a series of remarkable documentaries entitled See It Now. We often hear Vietnam referred to as the first living room war. I don't think that's entirely accurate. It was the reporting of people like Murrow, his boys, and other radio journalists who first brought World War II into American living rooms. I think they had an enormous impact, particularly prior to Pearl Harbor, and letting Americans know the nature of the war, the nature of the enemy that the British were facing, and building up significant American support for that war. I think that in creating this form of journalism, we can divide broadcast reporting really into two phases: before Murrow and after Ed Murrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm here sort of on the coattails of Robert Trout and Walter Cronkite and National Public Radio to talk about D-Day and how D-Day was covered by the broadcasting industry. The benchmark I think we should really start out with, though, is December 7th, December 8th, 1941. Some of you have probably heard John Daly interrupting the New York Philharmonic broadcast with the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. This was in fact a kind of a fictional concoction of Fred Friendly, who, not Pearl Harbor, but the manner in which Daly gave the news. He was producing a record album in the late 40s called I Can Hear It Now. And I suppose only Fred Friendly could believe that the announcement of Pearl Harbor lacked sufficient drama and needed to be punched up a little bit. So he spliced John Daly interrupting a broadcast for another bulletin several years later and affixed it to the front of the Pearl Harbor announcement. So it sort of went into a mythology of radio that Daly had interrupted the New York Philharmonic, when in fact CBS News had a scheduled newscast on at Sunday afternoon at 2:30 in the afternoon, sponsored by Admiral. And the news of Pearl Harbor moved about 2 minutes before that broadcast, so Daly was able to very hastily make it the lead story. The point, though, really is that this is really a remarkable document I'm holding here. This is a log, a broadcast log for the NBC Red Network, December 7th and December 8th. And if you looked at it, I think you would be mildly astonished to learn that after 2:30, 3:30, after about up until 5:30, there was more or less continuous news of the developments with the Japanese attack. But as of 6 o'clock, NBC was moving into sponsored time, and as a result, there was no further continuous coverage of Pearl Harbor. Believe it or not, on the night of December 7th, that Sunday evening, Jack Benny, The Great Gildersleeve, Manhattan Merry-Go-Round, they all went on as scheduled, and live, by the way, not transcribed, interrupted only by very brief bulletins that updated listeners on the breaking story. What it tells you is that in those days, radio as a news organization, as a news medium, was little more than a headline service. The Associated Press had refused to sell its services to broadcasters as late as 1939, 1940. And at that time, December 7th, 41, I don't think radio really had the muscle tone built up yet to sustain the kind of coverage that you would expect in a national crisis of that magnitude. And in fact, the log continues into December 8th. At noontime, President Roosevelt went to Congress to ask for a declaration of war, but if you were listening to the radio between 10 and noontime, you would have heard Pepper Young's Family, David Harum, you would have heard all the soap operas that were normally in place on the schedule. Well, all that changed, of course, by 1944. By that time, the war had created a situation in which the networks had the resources and the personnel and the brain power and the infrastructure to launch the kind of coverage and sustain the kind of coverage that the invasion of northern France justified the opening of a second front in Europe. There was, D-Day was one of those kind of unusual stories. Unlike Pearl Harbor, unlike September 11th, unlike November 22nd, which sort of struck like a bolt from the blue and surprised and shocked everyone, everybody knew that D-Day was coming. Everybody knew that there would be a second front in Europe. And everybody knew that the war was going to pivot on the results of that invasion. What nobody knew, though, was the precise place that the invasion would occur or the precise time. So despite the fact that the second front was a known quantity, there was still a tremendous air of expectancy and anticipation as the weeks passed through the spring of 1944. The build-up to D-Day in London, the military build-up, was really paralleled by a build-up by the radio networks. All kinds of details had to be worked out. During April and May, there were constant meetings with sponsors, with advertising agencies, because it was anticipated that the invasion would, for the first time, cause radio to preempt normally scheduled programs. And that is indeed what happened. It's the first time, really, in radio. D-Day, the way D-Day was covered, you could really almost call it the birth of journalism, broadcast journalism as we know it today, because schedules, commercial schedules were completely thrown aside, and reports from France were more or less continuous from the first moment of the invasion. There was quite a bit of expectancy and anticipation in the air, and clues, of course. On May 14th, CBS produced a special 30-minute program one evening detailing how the network would cover the invasion. It was a very business-like program, and it talked about the rules and regulations under which the news would be moved when the big show, as it was called then, finally got underway. The day after the program, May 15th, CBS sent out a lengthy bulletin to its 143 affiliate stations, detailing further all the methods and procedures that would take effect when the moment came. On Friday, June 2nd, CBS teletyped to its affiliates that it would, from this moment forward, be operating the network, the full network, until 3:05 a.m. every morning. It attached a disclaimer saying that this is in no way should this be inferred as any signal that the invasion is imminent. Well, in the tautness of this open-ended countdown, it was probably inevitable that something would go wrong, and something did go wrong. It was a little after 4:30 on Saturday afternoon, June 3rd. A little after 10:30 in London. In London, at the Associated Press office, a young woman named Joan Ellis, a 22-year-old trainee, was being instructed in how to operate an Associated Press teletype machine. Well, perhaps you can imagine what happened. She inserted a tape into what she thought was a dormant machine, but the safety block apparently had been removed or was not functioning, and it sucked the tape in, and AP teletypes across the country, across the United States, began to clatter with the news that Eisenhower had announced landings in France. A few years ago, I did a piece on this with Bob Trout for NPR, after having found the original broadcast in the National Archives. And I brought that along tonight, and in a moment I'll ask the people up there to just play it for you. On the screen, you'll see the Associated Press printout that Bob Trout saved for many years, and the paper that he actually read from that evening. So if you could play cut number 3, please.
Before it escaped. But I was quicker. Rushing through the door to CBS Studio 9, I broke in on Ted Husing from Belmont Racetrack and was on the air within a minute, reading the news with calm reserve.
This is Bob Trout speaking from Columbia's news headquarters in New York. At precisely 39 minutes past 4 o'clock Eastern Wartime, the Associated Press sent a flash. Here's the entire bulletin. London, June 3rd. General Eisenhower's headquarters announced tonight that Allied forces had landed in France. We are pressing for a further clarification. This bulletin has come to you from CBS World News. We now resume our scheduled program.
Of course, the Associated Press did not move quick enough for Bob Trout. This is, in fact, a copy of the original teletype as it came out of the machine with Bob Trout's notations on it, as he had to go back on the air, and it must be surely a broadcaster's worst nightmare. He had just broadcast the greatest, most important news bulletin of his entire career, only to have to go on 4 or 5 minutes later and say it wasn't true. Let's listen to his recantation.
A story was circulated a few minutes ago that Allied troops had landed in France. That report appears now to have been based on erroneous information. Here is what has happened. At precisely 39 minutes past 4 o'clock Eastern Wartime, the Associated Press sent a flash. It said merely, Eisenhower's headquarters announced Allied landings, France. That's the entire flash. A few moments later, the Associated Press followed this flash with a bulletin. Here's the entire bulletin. London, June 3rd. General Eisenhower's headquarters announced tonight that Allied forces had landed in France. Then about 2 minutes after that, at 4:41 Eastern Wartime, the AP sent another flash. This one said, "Withhold publication, London flash, Eisenhower acknowledged landings France." This second flash was quickly followed by a bulletin. It said, "An urgent message from London has killed the first flash saying that Eisenhower had landed. There is no immediate explanation, but we are trying urgently for clarification." Next came this one. "The flash and bulletin on the Allied landings in France have been killed. Make certain the story is not published." The last item in this story is the next bulletin sent by the Associated Press at 4:50. Bulletin note to editors. London now advises us that the flash on Eisenhower's announcement of Allied landings in France was sent through a transmission error. We are pressing for a further clarification. That's the story so far. This bulletin has come to you from CBS World News. Stay tuned.
Well, those are the experiences that go into a great career sometime. Bob told me later on that in between reading those two announcements, he got up from the microphone and went over, looked out the window from 485 Madison Avenue and looked down on Madison and noticed that cars were stopping and horns were honking. He could hear ships' whistles in the harbor in the East River and the Hudson River. And he thought to himself, my, did I do that? And he did, because CBS moved quickly and got the story out. NBC did not move the story. They apparently received the bust in time to stop it. The original bulletin and the bust came only 2 minutes apart. Well, of course, 3 days later, the big news did happen. Nobody knew when it was going to happen. When it finally did pop, it was I think the first news moved on the wires at about 12:37 a.m. on June 6th, just into June 6th, the very early hours of the morning, and that would have been Eastern Wartime. CBS, at that point, a man named Ned Calmer and Jesse Zausmer were sort of manning the graveyard shift at New Trier at CBS. And Zausmer, who's a writer and essentially a news director, acting news director for that particular shift, was reluctant to go on the air with it and waited for a secondary confirmation from another news service. The initial bulletins did not come from the WWII or from any American source at all. They were simply Associated Press reports that the German Transocean News Service had reported that the invasion was underway. So on this particular night, with Bob's false invasion report fresh in their minds of 3 days before, NBC got the scoop. This is what it sounded like as they interrupted a dance band from the Astor Hotel.
We interrupt our program to bring you a special broadcast. The German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. I repeat, the German news agency Transocean said today in a broadcast that the Allied invasion had begun. There was no Allied confirmation. The German broadcast could be one which Allied leaders have expected would be made with the purpose of upsetting Patriot plans inside the conquered countries. This bulletin has come to you from the NBC newsroom in New York. We return you now to your regularly scheduled program.
CBS went on the air at about 10 minutes to 1 with the news, then again at 1 o'clock. Then at half-hour intervals, there were subsequent bulletins with essentially no new news. Bob Trout came into the studio at 2 o'clock, broadcast 15 minutes at 2 o'clock and at 2:30. At 3 o'clock, he finally took to the microphone and would remain on the air until 10 o'clock the next morning. Let's play cut number 7, please. about a half an hour after he did it.
CBS World News, Bob Trout speaking. It has now been nearly 2 hours since the first German radio announcement that the invasion had begun. Frankly, we don't know at this time whether those German news agency reports that the invasion has begun are true or not. However, the scarcity of any details from the Germans in these 2 hours after the first announcement do throw very strong doubt on the possible truth of the German story.
I guess that's what you call hedging your bets when you put out news. Bob went into the newsroom with a portable microphone and started reading off from the teletypes. And just before 3:27 in the morning, Paul White, the news director, called Trout into his office and told him that he had just received a phone call from Washington saying that CBS and all networks should expect a special important message from the Army Signal Corps at exactly 3:32:0. Trout went back into the teletype room and resumed the broadcasting. Among the rattling teletypes, he noticed that one of them, the WWII machine, had been silent all night. Let's pick up the final broadcast of Robert Trout just as the official announcement is made.
And that report came in at 3:01 in the morning, in other words, about half an hour ago on the OWI wire. It seems that the OWI is waiting cautiously before putting out anything on these German reports. So far, all these reports have been German. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a special announcement from the Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Forces from London, from Colonel R. Ernest Dupuy. Go ahead, London.
This is Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The text of communique number 1 will be released to the press and radio of the United Nations in 10 seconds. Repeat, 10 seconds from now. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Well, that, of course, made it official. R. Ernest Dupuy, Ernie Dupuy, had been a military analyst at NBC. He had written a book, as a matter of fact, in 1937 on the military situation in Europe with George Fielding Eliot, who was, at this particular time, CBS's military consultant. And during Desert Storm, about 12 or 13 years ago, I noticed that Dupuy's son was serving as a military consultant for ABC News. So I contacted him and asked him what he knew about his father and particularly his participation in the D-Day announcement. And he said, it's kind of an interesting story. Obviously, there were large issues at stake in D-Day, but that did not mean that petty politics were not still afoot. There was a certain tension in who should read the first announcement. The English wanted Richard Dimbleby to read it, who was one of the leading broadcasters on the BBC. The Americans wanted an American voice to read it. And Dupuy was caught in the middle of this tension, so he just said, the hell with it, I'll read it myself, and that's just what he did. He had no stopwatch in front of him. When he clocked off those 10 seconds, he simply counted and then read the message. And at that point, everybody knew that the invasion was on. I'm sorry Dick Hotlett is not here tonight because my final little actuality was just a few seconds of Dick Hotlett. And I might as well play it anyway because he was the first American reporter to actually file an eyewitness account of the landing. He broadcast from London for about 20 minutes after having flown over the invasion beaches of Utah, then returned to London to do his story. So let's just listen to that for just a few seconds, and that'll be it.
Now for the report of Richard Hotlett of CBS. Go ahead, London.
This is Richard C. Hotlett speaking from London. The Allied forces landed in France early this morning. I watched the first landing barges hit the beach exactly on the minute of H hour. I was in a 9th Air Force Marauder flying at 4,500 feet along 20 miles of the invasion coast. From what I could see during those first few minutes, there was nothing stopping the assault parties from getting ashore. We spent about half an hour over enemy territory. We flew over and bombed some of the coastal fortifications, but except for some light flak from inland positions and from some tanks firing at us, we saw no enemy gunfire. The only other sign of life in enemy territory were some white and yellow parachutes dotting the ground where our paratroopers had hit the ground. The weather is favorable for the operation.
Well, with this evening, modern broadcast journalism really came into its own for the first time. And D-Day and the breaking story of D-Day was the object of radio's attention for the next 24 to 36 hours. And I hope that gives you a sense of what it might have been like to be around then.
This session was scheduled to end at 6:30, but we're going to cut it short. I'd like to have a chance, though, for you to ask questions for 10 minutes of anyone on the panel. If anyone would like to step up to the mic or stand up. Or... Yes, sir.
I have a recollection that for some reason or other, Larry Lasser of CBS News got into trouble with censorship or breaking news or something or other in connection with D-Day. Can anyone explain what happened and why?
I'm not aware. Larry was supposed to go on the air with some new gadgetry that supposedly permitted him to broadcast live from battle areas. None of it worked, so he was essentially off the air for the next 3 weeks. The only person I know of at CBS who encountered censorship problems within CBS was Cecil Brown. He went on to have a fairly long career. I think he wound up at ABC in the 1960s. But Cecil Brown was Paul White, who was the news director at CBS, was a UP man himself, and he had very strict rules about objectivity. And many of the reporters felt that they were carried to an extreme, and he was enforcing them in an unrealistic way. And Cecil Brown made some remarks on the air once about, the support for the war was flagging and American morale was declining. He didn't really say anything that Murrow or Severide hadn't said, but maybe they had just said it a little bit softer or a little differently. Maybe they were closer to Paley. But in any case, Cecil Brown lost his job. He was the only one I can think of who encountered censorship problems of that sort.
Kid in those days, and you followed war correspondence the way today's kids follow baseball stars. And it was definitely Lasser, and as I recall, the discipline was not by the network, but by the military. So I guess I got to go back in my books and see what I can find about
Larry
this.
stayed at CBS for many years after 1944. He left in 1960, followed Ed Murrow into the USIA.
Thank you.
But I think Larry Lasser was on the ground on the beaches, and Murrow was in the air.
Right.
Or was it London?
Yes.
I recently heard a broadcast by Wright Bryan who worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I believe, and I had thought that he was the first or one of the first to report from Normandy, and I'm wondering if you know who he is, and did numerous journalists go over with the airplanes?
Yeah, Wright Bryan, he had gone over on a C-47 with the parachute drop behind the lines before the actual invasion. And then he turned around and came back in his C-47. So he was not actually broadcasting hitting the beaches. He was broadcasting the airdrop behind the lines. And there were, after that R. Ernest Dupuy announcement, there were a fairly quick succession of broadcasts, some of which had been filed prior to the invasion but held until the official announcement was made, so that it wouldn't anticipate the announcement before it was official. But Wright Bryan, he was covering the airdrop. He was reporting on the airdrop behind the German lines.
Yes.
This question is for Mr. Rooney. You were working with the Stars and Stripes when Dick Wingert and Bill Malden were working for that publication as well, and I was wondering if you could say something about the way that they worked and why their work was so important to the soldiers and why they were so popular during the war.
Well, they were brilliant cartoonists. Dick Wingert was primarily funny, and Malden always had more substance to his work, although they were both, we were lucky to have two cartoonists as good as Malden and Wingert. Dick Wingert. Malden worked in Italy for most of the war before he moved in after the invasion, and Dick Wingert was always in London, and then he was in Paris, but they were brilliant.
Andy, didn't your friend George Patton try to get rid of Malden?
Well, he did. Malden, after Malden came to Paris, Patton came to the office one day and said that Malden had Bill Malden had drawn a cartoon of George Patton standing on the rim of this wonderful canyon with his two pearl-handled pistols on them, and this was a beautiful view. And Patton is saying to his assistant, "Is there one of these views for the enlisted men?" and Patton hated it, and he tried to get him fired. And fortunately, I must say, for the military people at the Stars and Stripes, they denied Patton's request to fire Dick Wingert or Malden.
Yes, sir.
Let me just say one other thing about Malden. I think it was Malden. In 1969, when Eisenhower died, I think it was Malden who had just this wonderful cartoon. It was a picture of a military cemetery, presumably Normandy, with the rows and rows of crosses. And up front, there was a little fresh mound of dirt. And the caption was, "It's Ike himself, pass the word."
Over here?
This is primarily directed to Mr. Rooney as a reporter, but also to the others as well. We know that Bataan was kept from the American people because we didn't want to kill morale, and Bataan would have hurt American morale. How much effort did you do to self-censor the reporting you were doing in order to not hurt morale of the soldiers or not hurt morale of the American people because we were losing in the first part of the war?
To me.
Yeah.
I was unaware, or maybe I was naive. I was unaware of any censorship in the Stars and Stripes. The reporters, there were quite a few of us, and we all knew what the war was about, and we knew who we wanted to have win the war. And we knew what would be valuable information to the Germans, and we just didn't write it. So there was never any occasion for our work to be censored. I don't think there's any substance to there was no negative attitude on the part of the staff of the paper.
Okay. Yes.
As I recall, Harry Butcher was a former employee for CBS before joining General Eisenhower's team. Do you think he influenced the general with any type of broadcasting?
Harry Butcher's career went back to a station called WJSV in Washington, which was bought by CBS and became the CBS owned and operated station in 1932. Today it's WTOP, that's the big CBS Washington station. And Butcher, I believe, was general manager or something of WJSV in the very early 30s. And I know that Bob Trout was working at WJSV then, and that's where Trout and Butcher became good friends. Of course, later on, as you say, Butcher became is closely associated with Eisenhower. That's all I know about Butcher's broadcasting prior to the war, though, his association with WJSV.
Yeah. Two more questions. Yeah.
Yes, I think any of y'all that can comment on this, but I think you referred to William Shirer as Ed Murrow's assistant in Vienna, and I thought he had been a correspondent in Berlin for a number of years before the war. And if any of y'all could comment on both how did Shirer end up as Ed Murrow's assistant, and also what he did throughout the rest of the war.
I'll comment on that one. Bill Shirer was indeed a reporter essentially in Berlin before teaming up with Murrow. And he was in financial difficulties. He'd just been fired from one of the wire services. I'm not quite sure. It might have been INS. But Murrow knew that he was a very able journalist, and so he hires Bill Shirer, and in effect, they concoct the idea of bringing in full-time network correspondents rather than having to reach out on an ad hoc basis to print reporters, and the job they eventually achieve, bringing in all of Murrow's boys, is to put the broadcast journalist on the same footing as a correspondent.
I'm afraid I just got the word we're going to have to cut this off. I appreciate your coming. Thank you very much.